Chapters 11 and 12 of Anybody But Anne by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 11. Archer's Theory. For some reason best known to himself, the coroner next called upon the three men who formed the village committee. These were Mr. Miller, Mr. Brandt, and Mr. Garson. As he had been chairman of the committee, Mr. Brandt was chosen to speak for the three. The witness was a middle-aged and dignified-looking man of a fine presence. He told in a straightforward manner of the proposed gift from Mr. Van Wyck to the village. He said further that the committee thought the project was extravagant, and they felt much hesitation on accepting the library. But he said the more they demurred, the more insistent Mr. Van Wyck became. And he finally persuaded them that they had no right to refuse so valuable an institution for their village, and so, he concluded, they had decided to accept it, and had come the night before to attend to the formalities. It was clearly impossible to connect these gentlemen in any way with the crime, but I surmised that Mr. Mellon hoped to get some important evidence from them. He questioned Mr. Brandt closely as to the attitude and behavior of Morland Van Wyck during the evening, and also inquired concerning the secretary. But Mr. Brandt said nothing enlightening. He admitted that the Van Wicks, father and son, had discussed the project hotly. He even admitted that the discussion could properly be called a quarrel. Of the secretary he had nothing to say, as he had merely performed clerical duties and took no part in the actual business of the meeting. The necessary papers constituting the deed of gift had been drawn but not signed. For technical reasons they had been left overnight in the possession of Mr. Van Wyck, who had said he would put them in his safe. Mr. Brandt further testified that the three committee men had left at about 11:15, and that Mr. Van Wyck had bidden them a hearty and pleasant good night. Mr. Brandt spoke for his committee in expressing regret that the deed of gift was missing. And indeed it was quite evident that the regret occupied the minds of the three men almost to the entire exclusion of the more tragic happening. This shocked me, until I remembered that they were only slightly acquainted with David Van Wyck, and even that acquaintance was not of a friendly character. Perhaps, then, it was not to be wondered at that they felt more keenly the loss of the projected gift than the loss of its giver. I was secretly glad that the deed of gift was lost, although being unsigned it was probably valueless. But since David Van Wyck was dead, I felt a decided satisfaction that his fortune must necessarily remain in his own family instead of being given away. Next to give evidence were the guests of the house. Mrs. Stelton seemed almost to enjoy the importance of being questioned as a witness, and answered volubly and with an evident intention of making a good impression on the audience. She spoke to them rather than to the coroner, and showed a certain personal interest that was clearly meant to imply that she was or would sometime be a permanent member of the Van Wyck household. And yet, though she cast frequent glances at Morland, they were not always responded to, nor did he seem absorbedly interested in what she was saying. Then, too, her testimony was of no importance whatever. She could tell nothing that was not already known, and her opinions were absolutely valueless. She was soon dismissed, and Beth Fordyce took her place. As she rose from her seat and went slowly forward to the chair indicated for her, she looked so listless and distracted that I wondered if she would be able to repeat the story she had told me. I think Mr. Mellon gathered from her appearance that her evidence would not be of much importance, for after a few preliminary details he said in a most uninterested way, "Can you tell us, Miss Fordyce, of any circumstance or evidence bearing on the case that we have not already heard?" "I certainly can," and Beth Fordyce's blue eyes lighted up as if with a realization of her own self-importance. And then, in a manner which amazed me, she gave a clear and definite account of the motor car and the strange man she had seen the night before. "And I am not sure it was a man," she said as she came to that part of her story. "I saw only a medium-sized person with a long coat on, and as the figure crawled stealthily along in the shadow of the house, I could not discern if it might be a man or a woman." "This is indeed most important, Miss Fordyce," said the coroner, evidently pleased to find something to work on. "It is extremely probable that the figure you saw was that of the criminal we are seeking." "But what good does that do?" inquired Miss Fordyce earnestly, "since you have no idea who the person could have been." "But we may be able to find out. At least we have a tangible clue to work upon." The clue seemed to me a most intangible one, and I couldn't help thinking that any story of Beth Fordyce's would have to be corroborated by someone else before it could have much weight with me. I glanced at Markham, and saw that he was intently studying the face of the witness as he made a few notes on a bit of paper. Without a doubt he meant to interview her alone later. Of course, the appearance of a strange motor at midnight was exceedingly important if true. But who could say it was not one of the hallucinations or visions to which Miss Fordyce was unfortunately subject? I looked at the others. Barbara and Morland looked frankly incredulous. They knew the girl, and I know they thought her story might be true and might not. Anne looked eager, as if hoping that here was at least a beginning of the solution of this mystery. Archer looked uninterested, and kept his eyes on Anne as if trying to read her thoughts. Mrs. Carstairs and her son were greatly agitated. Mrs. Carstairs controlled it, and the valet did not. But as they had been agitated during most of the inquest, I could not tell whether Miss Fordyce's story had made any special impression on them or not. And then again I remembered their search in the road. Could there be any connection between their mysterious searching and the mysterious motor car? But Miss Fordyce was still on the witness stand. The coroner evidently thought that she was an important witness after all, and questioned her on many subjects. In response to one of his inquiries, she repeated a remark which Morland had made to his father at dinner the night before. This speech was to the effect that Mr. Van Wyck would be sorry if he carried out his plan. I couldn't believe that Beth intended even to cast a shadow of suspicion in Morland's direction, but to the eager crowd waiting for a straw to show which way the wind blew, this speech was indicative. And yet, quite unconscious, apparently, of having said anything by way of suggestion, Beth took her seat, placid and unruffled. But to Morland, evidently the shaft had struck home. He remembered he had said that to his father. He realized that it might react against him. I thought of this, too, and then I remembered that Lassiter had sworn that he had left Morland alone with his father, and Morland had given him the lie. But already Archer was testifying. The gist of his evidence was practically the same as the others, but he related it in a concise, straightforward way that held the attention of his hearers. He said that he had said good night to the ladies at about 10:30 the night before, and that then, in company with me, he had gone to the smoking room, where we stayed for perhaps half an hour, both going to our rooms at about 11 o'clock. He then told of our meeting again at the breakfast table, and of Anne's coming to the dining room to tell us of Mr. Van Wyck's non-appearance. Of course, the rest of his story was practically a repetition of the others. "Have you any theory regarding the crime?" asked Mr. Mallon, and the oft-repeated question took on a new interest as Archer said thoughtfully, "It's hardly a theory, but I should like to suggest an idea that may or may not be plausible." "What is it?" asked the coroner with interest. "I'm afraid it will sound absurd," said Archer slowly and seriously, "but it is the only explanation I can think of, which would be even a possible solution of the mystery. Though I'm not a detective, nor can I deduce facts from circumstantial evidence or clues, yet this possibility I speak of is merely an adaptation of a story I once read. In this story, a well-known work of fiction, a young woman was found murdered, and the weapon could not be discovered, although it had left a small round hole." Intense interest was manifest all over the room. Necks were craned to get a better view of the speaker. The listeners fairly hung on his words, and many felt that the mystery was about to be solved. "In a word," went on Archer, "the weapon used was a sharp, slender icicle. As you may readily understand, it performed its fatal deed and then melted, leaving no trace. As you can see, this is not only possible, but credible and plausible. At this season there are no icicles, but I offer merely as a suggestion that if Mr. Van Wyck's death is a suicide, may it not be that the weapon was an icicle, shaped, let us say, by his own hand, from a piece of ice taken from the water pitcher?" "By Jove!" The whispered exclamation came from Lassiter, the secretary. He was staring at Archer and muttering beneath his breath. "He's struck it," he declared. "That's the only solution, and it must be the right one. Clever fellow." "He didn't deduce it," I whispered back to the secretary, for to tell the truth I was a little jealous that I hadn't thought of it myself, for I too had read the book in question. "He merely remembered having read of such a thing. "All the same, he's right," returned Lassiter, "and I wish I'd thought of it." The coroner was greatly impressed with this new idea. He turned to Dr. Mason and asked his opinion. The old doctor looked thoughtful. "I wouldn't say it was impossible. But you must remember, gentlemen, the hole left by the weapon in this case is small and perfectly round. Would it not be difficult to make artificially a smooth, round icicle, strong enough to pierce clothing and flesh and strike the heart with a fatal blow?" "It would be difficult," said the coroner, "but I must admit it seems to me the only solution. By the process of elimination we must conclude that this is the truth." "Rubbish!" exclaimed the detective Markham, who had scant patience with the coroner's pompous manner. "Consider the facts. Let us suppose a pitcher of ice water had been brought into the room. Was it?" He looked around inquiringly. "Yes," said Morland. "Father rang for it, and the butler brought it in." "At what time?" "About 10 o'clock, I should say. Well," triumphantly went on the detective, "then I hold that after 12 o'clock there would not be sufficient ice left in the pitcher from which to make this deadly icicle." Dr. Mason nodded his head, and indeed we all felt that the icicle theory was rather untenable. "Well," said Archer, "it is merely a suggestion toward the explanation of the mystery. It may or may not be the correct solution. But what seems to me more important is to learn who was the last person to see Mr. Van Wyck alive. The absence of that deed of gift seems to me a very peculiar feature. A burglar would take pearls or money, but he would have no reason for taking that deed." The coroner looked thoughtful. "If Mr. Van Wyck was murdered," he said, "there must have been a motive for the deed. It is true that a burglar would desire only money or valuables. We must conceive, then, the deed being done, that the murderer, if it is a murder, must have been some one interested in keeping Mr. Van Wyck's fortune away from the library." The coroner had only put into words what everybody present had been uneasily thinking. The missing deed seemed to prove that the murderer was one of the household; for who, except the members of the family, would care whether Mr. Van Wyck gave away his money or not? Of course my glance flew straight to Anne to see how she took this blow. She sat very still, and her face was white, even to the lips. I could see it was only by a brave exercise of will power that she kept herself from collapse. Morland looked angry and belligerent. He glared at Lassiter, and the secretary responded with a stare equally unfriendly. Barbara looked horror-stricken. She seemed about to speak, and then shut her lips tightly, as if determined to say nothing at this crisis. In agony my heart cried, "Anybody but Anne!" I was unable to keep still. "Nonsense!" I exclaimed. "You are theorizing about data. Your implication is unwarranted and false." The coroner looked at me, not reprovingly, but as if deeply interested. Then he dismissed Archer from the stand. 12. Anne's testimony. Mrs. Van Wyck was next called to testify. If Barbara had appeared calm and composed, the same could not be said of Anne. She was white and trembling to the very lips. She tottered as she walked, and with an audible sigh she sank into the chair placed for her. But all this, at least to my mind, in no way impaired her strange, eerie beauty. Her large gray eyes looked almost black against the whiteness of her pallor, and as she swept a mournful, unseeing glance round the room I endeavored to intercept her gaze and give her a nod of sympathy and help. But she did not look at me, and, clasping her hands in her lap, prepared to meet the ordeal of the coroner's questions. Mr. Mellon looked at her for a moment before he spoke, and his hard face took on a slightly softer expression at the sight of her evident distress. In what he doubtless meant to be a gentle voice he said, "When did you last see your husband alive, Mrs. Van Wyck?" To my surprise, Anne showed a decided agitation. She clasped her hands tightly to her breast, and in a choked, almost inaudible voice, she replied, "When he left me after dinner, to go to his study." "He was then in good health and spirits?" asked Mr. Mellon, and a more inane question I never heard. It seemed perfunctory, as if the man scarcely knew how to broach the subject. For a moment Anne simply stared at her questioner as if trying to control her voice. Then she said, "My husband was in perfect health, and yes, I think I may say he was in good spirits." "What were his last words to you as he left you?" If this were a random shot it was certainly a peculiar coincidence; for we all remembered how, as he left the room, David Van Wyck had whispered to his wife something that had caused her the deepest emotion. Anne's great eyes looked at each of us in turn. After the briefest glance at the others, she gazed longer at Archer. It may have been my imagination, but I thought he gave to her an almost imperceptible negative shake of his head. She looked frightened, and then her glance met mine. I so feared that any appearance of secrecy on her part would be prejudicial to her, that I nodded my head affirmatively, meaning for her to answer the question. "Must I tell that?" she asked in a pained voice. "Yes," said Mr. Mellon, "especially if it has any bearing on Mr. Van Wyck's death." But Anne did not hear the coroner's words. She was nerving herself for her reply, and she said in a low voice, but distinctly: "As he left me, my husband whispered to me that he would give the Van Wyck pearls as well as his gift of money to the library committee." A wave of indignation swept over the audience. Anxious as the villagers were for the gift of the library, not one of them would have wished Anne Van Wyck's jewels sacrificed in its cause. Elated by the sensational answer, the coroner continued. "Did he say anything more?" he inquired. "Must I tell that?" Anne scarcely breathed, her face as white as the handkerchief she held. And the coroner said inexorably, "Yes." Had Anne looked toward me then, I should have shaken my head, for I feared from her expression that the revelation would be a startling one. She looked dazed, she spoke almost as one in a trance, but she said clearly, "He said, 'Now, don't you wish I was dead?'" Doubtless it was unconscious and involuntary, but Anne had reproduced almost exactly the jeering tones of David Van Wyck's sarcastic voice, and not one of us doubted that those were the very words and the very inflection that had sounded in her ear as he had whispered to her just before leaving the drawing room. I well remembered the agonized expression on her face as he turned away from her, and I knew that at this moment she was vividly seeing a picture of the scene. The audience fairly rustled with this new sensation. The coroner seemed spurred, and with great enthusiasm continued his catechizing. "Why did he say that?" he said bluntly. "Had you wished him dead?" A murmur of indignation was heard from the audience, and both Archer and Morland started as if about to protest. But Anne raised her clear eyes to the coroner's face and said coldly, "No, I had never wished such a thing." "Why, then, did he speak that way?" "Mr. Van Wyck was quick-tempered and very sarcastic of speech," she replied. "I can only explain his remark by assuming that it was prompted by anger and sarcasm." "Mr. Van Wyck was angry, then?" "Yes, he was angry." "At what?" "He was angry because the members of his family were opposed to his plan of giving away practically all his fortune to a public institution." "And then Mr. Van Wyck left you, and you never saw him again alive?" That is so." Except for a slight hesitation, the statement was direct, but it was manifestly untrue. Anne's eyes fell, the color came and went in her cheeks, her foot tapped nervously on the floor, and she was rapidly tying her handkerchief into knots. A more agonized, indeed a more guilty demeanor could not have been manifested. At that moment my eyes met hers, and it flashed across me that she and I had looked in at the window of the study and had seen Mr. Van Wyck in colloquy with the committee. Perhaps it was telepathy that carried the same thought to her, for she said suddenly, and I know she spoke truly, "Oh, yes, I did see him again after that. I was walking on the terrace later, and I saw him through the study window, talking with his visitors." "At what hour was this?" inquired the coroner, as if the exact time of the incident were the turning point of the whole case. "I don't know," returned Anne carelessly. "Perhaps about 9:30 or 9:15, I should say." Mr. Mellon looked a little crestfallen, as if an important bit of evidence had gone wrong. To my mind he certainly was a blockhead, but, after all, he was merely there to ask questions, and if the jurymen desired, they could supplement his inquiries. I glanced at the detective Markham to see how he took it. He was exceedingly attentive to what was going on, and sat with his head slightly forward and his eyes alert, apparently gleaning more information than was offered by the mere spoken words. "And then," pursued the coroner, "after that glimpse through the window, you never saw your husband again alive?" Anne answered this in the negative, but so low and uncertain was her voice that she was obliged to repeat it twice before the coroner was satisfied with her reply. I felt a vague alarm. If Anne were speaking the truth, why should she act so strangely about it? And if, by any chance, she was not veracious, she must know that her manner was unconvincing. I had no interest in any one else who might be implicated in the tragedy, but my heart again cried out, "Anybody but Anne." "At what time did you retire, Mrs. Van Wyck?" went on the questioner. "I went to my room about 10:30. "And you retired then?" "I did not. I read for a time, and wrote some letters, and went to bed about midnight. Or perhaps it was later. I daresay it was 1:00. "Are you not sure?" "No, I didn't notice the time. Perhaps my maid can tell you. She was with me." So casual was Anne's manner now that the coroner seemed to realize his questions were not of particular importance, and he tried a new tack. "Was your husband kind to you, Mrs. Van Wyck?" Anne stared at him coldly for a few seconds, and then spoke with great deliberation. "I decline to answer such a question, and I'm sure you are overstepping your rights in asking it." Her manner even more than her words abashed the coroner, but to cover his chagrin he became insistent. "It is necessary that I should know if there was harmony between you," he declared. "I regret that the circumstances make it necessary for me to press the question." Anne's eyes flashed. Her agitation was gone now, and her poise and calmness seemed to disconcert her inquisitor even more than her embarrassment had. "There was perfect harmony between us," she said, holding her head proudly and looking straight at the coroner, "with the exception of this matter of the library. I tried to dissuade my husband from his intent, for his own sake quite as much as for my own, for I felt sure he would regret such quixotic generosity. But he was determined to proceed in his plan in spite of my protests." "And at the last moment he decided to add the valuable jewels to his gift?" "Yes. His words to me last evening were the first intimation I had had that he meant to give away the Van Wyck pearls." "Had you any reason to doubt your husband's sanity?" "None, except in this matter of the library gift. Nor do I call that insanity, but rather a monomania which possessed him temporarily." "Do you think your late husband hid the pearls, or do you think they have been stolen?" "I can form no opinion, as my husband's death is so wrapped in mystery. He may have secreted the pearls, or they may have been stolen by an expert burglar. Personally, I have no theories on the subject. It is all utterly mysterious to me." Anne passed her hand wearily across her brow with a gesture of exhaustion. I think this roused the coroner's sympathy, and he excused her from further questioning. Mrs. Carstairs was next called as a witness. There was a stir among the audience as she rose and walked slowly to the witness chair. It was quite evident that considerable curiosity was felt regarding this woman. I expected she would appear perturbed, but instead she had a calm air of superiority, and held her head high, as if entirely mistress of the situation. In spite of myself, I was obliged to admit that her face was fascinating in its expression, quite apart from the real beauty of her features. And then I suddenly realized that this remarkable woman was deliberately trying to charm the coroner by her demeanor. She was beautifully gowned, as always, in black lustreless crepe de chine, which clung to her beautiful figure in long sinuous lines, and which, to my imagination, gave her the effect of a beautiful serpent. Her personality affected me unpleasantly, and yet absorbed my attention entirely. She was so evidently conscious of the effect she produced, that it was as interesting as a play to watch her. The very way in which she sat in her chair was a picture of itself. But it was no strained or forced pose, merely the careless grace of a perfectly poised woman. I glanced at Anne, and was surprised to see that she, too, was looking at Mrs. Carstairs admiringly. The two women were deadly enemies at heart, and it seemed to me to indicate a fine, generous nature in Anne to forget her prejudice in an honest appreciation of the other's charm. Mr. Mellon looked at his witness a little uncertainly. Clearly he did not understand Mrs. Carstairs, and was not sure how to address a woman of this type. After the preliminary questions as to her position and length of sojourn in the family, he said almost abruptly, "Do you think Mr. Van Wyck was a suicide?" "It may be," replied Mrs. Carstairs, in low, musical tones. "Mr. Van Wyck had reason to wish to die, and there are those who wished him dead." As she said these words, Mrs. Carstairs dropped her eyes and sat quietly awaiting further questions. Her speech almost amounted to an accusation, and Morland looked at her with a face full of rage and with clenched hands. "Will you explain that implication, madam?" asked the coroner. "It was no implication. It was merely a statement." "Very well, then amplify it. Who are those who, in your opinion, wished the death of David Van Wyck?" Mrs. Carstairs assumed an expression of gentle pathos, which, while beautiful to behold, seemed to me the quintessence of hypocrisy. In a sad, low voice, she said slowly, "A man's foes shall be they of his own household." Mr. Mellon stared at her. "It is your opinion, then," he said, "that David Van Wyck's death may have been brought about by someone who lived under his roof?" "Do you not think so?" And the question was accompanied by a grave look of infinite pain. "You are here to answer questions, not to ask them. Nor are you invited to give unsupported opinions. If you know of anything, madam, definite and positive, that would lead you to suspect the thing you mention, tell us of it at once. But if not, kindly refrain from insinuation or implication." Mrs. Carstairs looked amazed rather than reproved. To my mind, she was suddenly confronted by a man who could not be cajoled by her fascinations, and who was outspoken in reply to her veiled hints. "Assuredly, I know of nothing definite, or I should have divulged it sooner." "To your knowledge, had Mr. Van Wyck an enemy in his own household?" "Enemy is a harsh word. But the man was far from happy with one who should have been his closest friend." "Meaning his wife?" "Meaning his wife." Mrs. Carstairs' face was white now, and her eyes had a steely glitter as she said these words, looking straight at the coroner. "You state, then, that Mr. Van Wyck was not happy in his marital relations?" "I state that emphatically." There was a murmur of disapproval all through the room at the trend of this conversation, and more than one was heard to whisper, "Shame!" and "This won't do." I could see that Archer, Morland, and the others were restrained from speech only by Anne herself. As I had noticed before when these two women clashed, Anne won by the force of her marvelous aloofness. She now sat regarding Mrs. Carstairs with an expression of slight scorn, which said far more strongly than words could have expressed that the witness was talking nonsense. Anne Van Wyck looked like a queen listening to the prattle of a demented subject, and her absolute indifference to the housekeeper's remarks was the one reason why her friends did not at once put a stop to the testimony. I saw at once that Anne's attitude was the best possible refutation of the housekeeper's evidence, and I saw, too, that Mrs. Carstairs was herself quite aware of this. I think Anne's look of supercilious scorn, almost tinged with amusement, acted as a whip to the housekeeper's burdened soul, and spurred her to greater effort. "I know of what I am speaking," Mrs. Carstairs went on, "for David Van Wyck was engaged to me when he met and wooed the lady he made his wife." She flashed a dazzling smile at the coroner, which went far to disturb that gentleman's equilibrium. It was then a breach of promise?" he said half involuntarily. "It was, yes. But of course I never sued him, or in any way asserted my rights. He was sufficiently punished by his unhappy marriage. His wife has always been jealous of me. She has endeavoured many times to have me dismissed from my position, but with no success. However," and here Mrs. Carstairs turned her direct gaze upon Anne, "since the death of her husband, Mrs. Van Wyck has asserted her intention of getting rid of me. I accuse no one. I only state that there are several who would consider themselves benefited by the death of David Van Wyck." The quiet intensity of the speaker's voice took away the melodramatic effect of the scene, and made her seem like an accusing angel speaking words of fate. There was a pause which was broken by Detective Markham, who burst out, with something the effect of a bombshell. "And your son is one of them." At last something had disturbed Mrs. Carstairs' calm. She turned white to the very lips, and she trembled as if mortally afraid. But she made a brave effort to control herself, and said distinctly, though in tones that quivered, "My son is in no way implicated." "Then what were you searching in the road for early this morning?" "I was not searching," began Mrs. Carstairs, and then, as she saw me looking intently at her, she stopped speaking. "You were," declared the detective. "There's no use your denying it. And later on, your son was seen searching in the same place. What clue was he looking for?" Mrs. Carstairs could not speak. Her lips moved inaudibly, but she was striving to pull herself together, and would doubtless have succeeded when, breaking the silence, the voice of Beth Fordyce was heard. It sounded weird, and the audience listened breathlessly as Beth said, in dreamy, far-away tones, "Wheel tracks. He was looking for wheel tracks. He was the man who came in the motor car. I recognize him now. It was Carstairs, Mr. Van Wyck's valet, who came into the grounds at midnight in a motor car. Who stopped, and hesitated, and proceeded, at intervals. Who left the car, and walked stealthily around the house, in the shadow of the eaves, evading the moonlight, seeking the shadow. The shadow." Miss Fordyce's voice trailed away in a whisper, and I knew that she was in one of the semi-trances, or whatever word might express the strange condition that sometimes enveloped her. She was perfectly conscious, but her mentality seemed dual. She envisioned other scenes than those she might be among, and while she saw them clearly, she spoke as if through a mist. The audience sat enthralled. Here at last was a hint of something real and tangible. Wheel tracks were legitimate clues. If Miss Fordyce's story were true, there was at last a way to look for light on the mystery. I glanced at Mrs. Carstairs, expecting to find her almost collapsed; but instead, she had again risen to the occasion, and resumed her grasp of the situation. I saw, too, that it was the alarm of her mother instinct that had nerved her to a renewed effort at composure, and she said quietly, "There is no meaning to the babble of a mind given to frequent hallucinations." But apparently the coroner thought there was, for he abruptly dismissed Mrs. Carstairs as a witness, and recalled her son. The valet looked wretched, but seemed ready to answer questions. "Did you come into this place in a motor last night at midnight?" the coroner shot at him. "No, sir." And the answer was firm, though in a low tone. "You have testified that you were at a ball in the village?" "Yes, sir. But I walked home. It isn't far, sir." "Can you prove that you were at this village ball? Did any of the servants of this house see you there?" "No, sir." "How does that happen?" snapped the coroner. "Were none of them present at the ball?" "I don't know, sir." "What do you mean? Look here, Carstairs, you weren't at the ball at all. Where were you? Were you out in a motor?" "No, sir. Oh, no, sir." The man's denial was so emphatic and his manner so agitated that it was palpably a falsehood on the face of it. "I think you were," the coroner went on, "and as I doubt your word, I will ask someone else." Then the coroner called for Ranny, the garage mechanician. This witness doggedly persisted that he knew nothing of Carstairs' whereabouts the night before. But persistent nagging by the coroner finally drew out the fact that the new touring car had been taken out. "How do you know it had?" asked the coroner, and Ranny seemed suddenly to decide that he would make a clean breast of the matter. "I seen the wheel tracks, sir," he said. "How did you know them from any other tracks?" "It's a new car, sir, and it has peculiar tires. You can't mistake the tracks, sir." I saw it all in a flash. Carstairs had taken the car out for a joy ride, and in order to escape discovery he had endeavoured to obliterate these peculiar tire marks from the dust of the road. And without a doubt his mother had been engaged in the same work of precaution. The detective also jumped to these conclusions, and after a few of his questions, in conjunction with the coroner's inquiries, they forced a confession from the valet. Carstairs' manner became sullen as he owned up to his wrongdoing. It seemed that the use of a motor car by any of the servants was a most grave offence in the eyes of David Van Wyck. And especially to take out the big new touring car was a daring thing to do. Seeing that the valet was not making a good story of it, his mother cleverly managed the coroner so that she told the story instead. As Rannie had divulged the secret, she admitted that her son had taken out the car the night before. She said that it was wrong, and that she did not excuse him for it, but that since David Van Wyck was no longer here to reprove or punish him, no one else had the right to do so, and that the offense was a thing of the past and should be forgotten. She admitted that she had heard her son return in the car, and that she was so worried about his wrong deed that she had tried to eliminate any possible proof against him in the matter of the wheel tracks. But, she concluded, this had no bearing on the crime of the night before, as her son had returned about 11 o'clock and had put the car away and had then retired. She overreached herself here, because the valet had previously testified that he came home about midnight, and both Miss Fordyce and Rannie agreed that the big car had arrived at about 12 o'clock. But when this was put to her, Mrs. Carstairs became excited again, and insisted that the hour of her son's return was of no consequence, as he had not gone to the study at all, and knew nothing of the occurrences there. "You have no right to suspect him," she blazed out finally. "It is wicked of you to do so." "We have not said we suspected him, madam," said the coroner gravely. "But if we do suspect him, or even feel inclined to investigate his story, it is because he has not been frank in the whole matter, and neither have you. And now I wish to ask you further. Did your son know that in the will of Mr. Van Wyck $5,000 was bequeathed to him, and $25,000 to yourself?" Mrs. Carstairs hesitated. "It would be wiser for you to tell the truth," prompted the coroner, "as you know a lack of frankness has not served you well so far. Now answer my questions truly." "Yes, we have both known of these facts for some years." "That is all, madam." And to my surprise Mr. Mellon dismissed the housekeeper without a further word. I did not quite understand his attitude in the matter, but I had no time to think about it, for I was just then called to the witness stand myself, and asked to give any information I could that might be of any assistance in solving the mystery. I had not had time to consider this new phase of the situation that included the valet's evidence, but I had previously made up my mind what I should say when called upon. End of chapters 11 and 12.